At 45, he walks in and the room shifts. At 21, he walked in unnoticed. At 45, his silence speaks louder than words. At 21, he learned when to stay quiet. At 45, people listen when he talks. At 21, he listened more than he spoke. At 45, his presence commands respect. At 21, he built himself without attention. At 45, he controls the situation. At 21, he learned to control himself. At 45, pressure doesn't shake him. At 21, pressure built him. At 45, he makes decisions without fear. At 21, he faced fear daily. At 45, he leads without asking. At 21, he followed discipline. At 45, his mind is sharp. At 21, he trained it every day. At 45, he stays calm in chaos. At 21, he learned to stay grounded. At 45, he doesn't chase validation. At 21, he stopped needing it. At 45, his energy is controlled. At 21, he controlled his habits. At 45, he chooses his words carefully. At 21, he learned the cost of speaking too much. At 45, he's respected everywhere. At 21, he worked in silence. At 45, he moves with purpose. At 21, he built direction slowly. At 45, his confidence is unshakable. At 21, it was fragile, but he built it. At 45, he doesn't react emotionally. At 21, he mastered his emotions. At 45, he stands alone if needed. At 21, he got comfortable being alone. At 45, his discipline shows in everything. At 21, discipline felt painful. At 45, he controls outcomes. At 21, he controlled effort. At 45, people trust his judgment. At 21, he built it through mistakes. At 45, his presence feels heavy. At 21, he felt invisible. At 45, he dominates without noise. At 21, he built in silence. At 45, he doesn't prove himself anymore. At 21, he proved it daily. At 45, he knows his value. At 21, he discovered it slowly. At 45, he walks with certainty. At 21, he walked with doubt but kept going. At 45, he's in control of his life. At 21, he learned control step by step. At 45, he commands respect naturally. At 21, he earned it quietly. At 45, his life is structured. At 21, he built that structure daily. At 45, he thinks before acting. At 21, he learned from acting too fast. At 45, he wins without showing off. At 21, he stopped chasing attention. At 45, his power feels effortless. At 21, it was anything but easy. At 45, he speaks less, but impacts more. At 21, he learned the value of silence. At 45, he lives on his own terms. At 21, he stopped following the crowd. At 45, everything about him shows control. Because power at 45 doesn't begin at 45. It begins at 21.